Thank you. I want to introduce David again and say that I'm glad that he would come spend this afternoon with us. David and his wife have a new 5-week-old baby. And boy?
Yep, Caleb.
Caleb, a little baby boy. And so he hasn't been getting a lot of sleep. And so we provided him with a flight down here and a flight back. So he's going to get more sleep, I think, on those flights than he's gotten in the last 5 weeks. But David's now the director of the Center for Faith and Work. And he's going to tell you about all of that as he helps us think through the things that they've thought through about discipleship and discipling our people in the area of living out their faith at work. So we're so glad to have you, and I'm going to turn it over. You may move over to the middle, David.
Thank you. Well, it's a pleasure to be here with you all, and thank you for getting me out of the cold for at least a day or a few hours. I have the unfortunate slot, the dreaded afternoon slot right after lunch, so I hope you guys will be able to track with me. I hope I'll be awake, actually. I'm probably the most in danger of taking a nap. But let me, that's Caleb. So he's just 5 weeks old and causing us a lot of trouble. But he's not the reason why I'm here. What I want to talk to you about, I want to start off with this quote and jump kind of right into it. It's a quote that you often see in terms of the relationship between the church and this area of work. Let me just read this to you. "And nothing has the church so lost her hold on reality as in her failure to understand and respect the secular vocation. She has allowed work and religion to become separate departments and is astonished to find that, as a result, the secular work of the world is turned to purely selfish and destructive ends, and that the greater part of the world's intelligent workers have become irreligious or at least uninterested in religion." And a couple lines later, she says, "How can anyone remain interested in a religion which seems to have no concern with 9/10 of his life?" So clearly she was talking about the New Yorker in terms of the 9/10 of his life. But this is a great quote. This was probably said about 60 years ago. And it's more true today than it was back then. Dorothy Sayers she's a writer, kind of a cultural commentary in England back in the 1950s and 60s, was friends with C.S. Lewis and that whole group. But she was trying to say back then, somehow the church has separated this idea of faith and work. And it led us to ask these questions. Why is that the case? Because it seems like a no-brainer that if the church is trying to disciple her people, that the church would be eagerly willing to help people see the integration of faith and work. And yet you see, as John alluded to this afternoon, that this is the great need in the church. And that has to start to raise some concerns. It has to raise some larger questions. Why is this the case? In some sense, if the main purpose of the church is to disciple people, why is it that the church is failing miserably in this area that consumes 60%, 70%, 80%, 90% of people's waking hours? I don't know if you've ever thought about that question, but that's an important question because it's kind of like Coca-Cola when they changed their formula back in the day. They lost the main focus on what people really wanted. And in some ways, the church, in this whole mission of discipling people, in some sense, have we lost sight of what we're supposed to be doing? So it began to raise larger questions, that this is not just an issue of faith and work, it's a larger question of discipleship as a whole. And if you think about, let me try to draw a parallel to the missionary endeavor. One of the great transformations in missions has been this idea of contextualization. That instead of this imperialized Christianity going into a nation and importing your version of Christianity into that particular region or area, we learned that it was important to understand the context, to be able to communicate the gospel meaningfully in the context that the gospel was entering. That kind of lit a light bulb to say, are we contextualizing our discipleship enough? And by contextualizing, I don't necessarily even mean culture or geography, but in a large scope of redemptive history, are we understanding what it means to create disciples? And so when you look at the Old Testament, let me give the example that there are two very distinct parts of Israel's history. One is Israel under Solomonic rule, the Golden Age. Jerusalem was this empire that other empires were coming to. They were delighting and marveling at the wisdom of this amazing little people that became this empire in a sense. And then a few generations later, not that far from Solomon's time, you know what happens to Israel. They go into exile. Now, here's a question. What would discipleship look like for Israel in Jerusalem versus in exile? Those different contexts would look very different. The kind of disciple that you would create would be very much influenced by that larger context. And I think we as a church, we have to ask that question, are we discipling people for Jerusalem? Or are we discipling people for exile, for Babylon? So this is a larger kind of question here. What would a disciple look like in each of these contexts? If you're in Jerusalem, you are the dominant culture. Meaning, you're an Israelite, you don't have to worry about trying to fit in because you are the dominant culture. You're building a kingdom within a kingdom. I'm sorry, this is now, let me take this in terms of not going back to the context of Israel, but taking these concepts of Jerusalem and exile and bringing them into the church today to figure out which paradigm have we adopted in the way that we think about discipleship. And so in a Jerusalem context, you're trying to gather people within your own kingdom, and you're building this kingdom within a kingdom. And the people that come into the church, they have an expectation of comfort and security. They want the church to be a place where they feel that kind of security and comfort. Your identity is taken for granted. The fact that you're a Christian, you just take for granted, because everyone's kind of a Christian. There's an inward orientation, meaning there's a desire to kind of internalize these things at a kind of deeper level than just kind of living it out externally. Triumphalistic attitudes towards surrounding cultures, meaning there's a sense that what we have is awesome and everyone should come to us. That's Jerusalem. In exile, if you're a Christian in exile, you're the minority culture. You're seeking the prosperity of an alien kingdom. If you think back to what God had called Israel to do in Babylon, I mean, it was amazing what God would have the audacity to say, I want you to seek the prosperity of a nation that was decimating you. I mean, that is just absurd. A nation that was marked by cruelty, by destruction, and somehow in that context, God was saying to his people, seek their prosperity. Expectations of discomfort and insecurity. If you're living in exile, you don't expect to be comfortable. You don't expect to feel secure. There's this kind of inherent insecurity because you're living in an alien nation, an alien empire. And your identity is always being challenged because, again, you're not the dominant culture. There's an outward orientation, meaning you have to now conform to the culture and the norms of this larger empire that you have been subsumed into. And so that forces you to have an outward orientation versus an inward. And there's a servant attitude towards surrounding cultures because recognizing that you are the minority voice, you're not here to lord it over people, you're here to serve them because you're not in that position of power. Now, if you look at those two different paradigms, you can see how a disciple would look very different in those two different contexts. And you can ask yourself, when you think about the discipleship in your own church, which paradigm seems to fit your particular model in your church? And I think for a lot of us here, the unspoken presupposition that shapes our understanding of discipleship is that we're living in Jerusalem and we're trying to create Jerusalem. Versus that we're living in exile. Because when you look at the New Testament, the language is pretty clear in terms of how the church needs to see itself. We are aliens and strangers. We are exiles. We're sojourners. We're waiting for New Jerusalem to come. And so the New Testament sets for us a very clear paradigm that when we think about discipleship, the church is to understand the context of exile to be the larger backdrop for how we train and equip our people. But unfortunately, we've somehow kind of mixed the stories up and we think, again, we're trying to build our churches to be mini kingdoms within a larger kingdom. And that's, in some sense, the heart of why faith and work seems to be so dead in a lot of churches. Because you don't want to equip people for life out there. You want to equip people for life in your church and your kingdom. And that's a serious issue that we have to come to grips with because it does come to issues of our own hearts. of what our own desires, our own desire to make a name for ourselves, to create a sense of value, identity, and worth. But when we think about Scripture and what Scripture is calling us to do in terms of the mission of the church to make disciples, we have to think seriously about this larger context of where are we? Are we in exile, or are we creating Jerusalem here in this world? Now, I wanted to go a little bit further in understanding what does this exilic kind of paradigm look like in the context of discipleship. One, the exilic perspective reinforces an outward rather than an inward orientation, assuming certain difficulties and challenges to be part and parcel of our earthly calling rather than pursuing the elimination of these discomforts as our goal. Meaning this, when you think about your church budget and how many dollars go into congregational care, for a lot of churches, that's a significant, sizable portion of the budget because you're trying to care for your people, and that's understandable. But what level of care is enough? Meaning some people come into the church expecting the church to take care of all my emotional needs and all the kind of troubles that I have, and it begins to actually take a considerable amount of the resources of the church. But if you have the presupposition that this is part of the reality of our broken world, you're not going to find in the church this security, this comfort that we're all yearning for. That comes when Christ comes. And so it begins to set our expectations differently so that even in our resource allocation, we begin to think maybe we've put way too much resources in this kind of congregational care, and this is why for most churches there is no line item for faith and work. And at best, it's maybe 1 or 2%. And you can see how seriously a church is committed to this idea of faith and work by looking at the budget, by looking at the numbers. How much money do you really invest into thinking about how to disciple your people for life outside the church? And a big part of why those dollars don't exist because so much of our resources are being spent in trying to create that therapeutic culture within our own church. Secondly, the exilic perspective reminds us that our calling extends beyond personal piety without overlooking the importance of it. It leads us to understand the importance of our context, contextualizing our discipleship beyond merely inward therapeutic self-improvement tendencies. I think that one's pretty self-explanatory. Third point here, the exilic perspective pushes back against a triumphalistic approach to the culture around us and reminds us that we are called to distinctly work and serve the world as God's people. Our home is not here, but awaits us in the future with the return of Christ. I think there are two models of cultural engagement. One that says, let's get Christians into the culture and into positions of power so that we can now exert that power over our culture. That's what I mean by a triumphalistic nature or spirit. And when we understand in exile that we're not trying to take over the world. Christ is the one who reigns over this world. He's the one who says, I know when I'm going to come back. I know when I'm going to set my kingdom on earth. And until that time comes, we labor, we serve. And it pushes back against, I think, that attitude that somehow all that we need to do to gain back or win back the culture is to send our people and try to get them as elevated in positions of leadership as possible. That's not the kind of exilic mindset as much as the exilic mindset is really about getting people into this attitude of service, of understanding that it's not about getting into positions of power as much as understanding what does it mean to effectively serve the people around us where we are and where God places us. Fourth here, the exilic perspective reshapes our understanding of discipleship and the kind of disciples we are to nurture. We help train, quote, exilic disciples as opposed to, quote, Jerusalem disciples who are trained to enter into the world with a developed sense of public engagement, both vocationally as well as seeking the common good. So again, in an exilic discipleship framework, part of the necessary training is to help people understand how they engage the secular world around them. They have to. In order to survive as a Christian, you have to know how you engage the world because that's where you're spending most of your time. The exilic perspective shapes the way we spend our marginal time. We want to encourage our people to engage our neighbors in our world rather than spending all of our free time in church programs. Meaning for a lot of us, as Christians become more serious about their faith, for whatever reasons, they actually spend more and more time in the church. They get into different positions of leadership. And instead of thinking from an exilic mindset, these are the people that we need to push out into the world, not keep in the church. We keep in the church those people who need to be nurtured, who need to be fed, who need to grow in Christ. But the people who have a mature faith, send them out into the world. And what ends up happening is, in that Jerusalem mindset, because we're trying to build a kingdom within a kingdom, these are the people we're retaining, and we're not bringing the salting influence of the church out into the world. Our best people are staying inside the church and not being released to actually become salt and light into the communities around us. And this has some pretty significant impact on the structure of your programs. When you think about your programming in your church, what's your expectations for the Christians in your congregation, especially the mature ones? Do you expect them to come to church 1, 2, 3 times a week? Or do you expect them to come on Sunday and maybe they'll be a part of an occasional group, once a quarter? That might sound like almost blasphemy in our kind of current understanding of church structure. But I would even quote John Stott, who in some ways lamented this idea of the weekly small group, because in the small margins that people have, the mature Christians were constantly being pulled to the church and not into the world where they could be effective as witnesses of Christ. So, all right, I hope, I'm going to keep on moving so that you guys don't start thinking too badly of me. The exilic perspective should not neglect the critical importance of evangelism. Rather, it lays a meaningful context in the plausibility structures for evangelism in fostering a common love for the city and a desire to see it flourish. I don't want to pit engaging the city in evangelism against each other. In fact, what I'm trying to say is when we're pushing people out into the city, it's counterintuitive because you feel like you're losing your best people. But when your best people in some ways are being deployed into the city, your church can grow because they're the people that can communicate the faith meaningfully, plausibly. They're the people that can say, look, this is why I am a Christian. This is why I believe the gospel. But when they start to engage the culture around them, engage their work more effectively, it creates what we call the plausibility structures for evangelism. Meaning, why should anyone believe you if you tell them that Jesus is the Son of God and He died so that He could pay for your sins, when there's no reason for them to actually think you're credible? But if you're credible in a certain area of your life, whether it's your involvement in the community, it's the excellence in which you do your work, all of a sudden that provides the plausibility structure for them to believe you when you now talk about Jesus. A lot of people don't have that plausibility structure because they're spending so much time in the church. Why should they believe you? Because the only time they see you is, once a month, or you walk by them, because you're rushing to do your work on time so that you can get to church in the evening time. And so again, the engagement of the world is actually what leads to more effective evangelism in the world. And so let me just show, for example, exilic discipleship, particularly in the New York City context, should possess the following characteristics to adapt to a particular growing demographic. Substantive content and intellectual depth, meaning for us to reach a growing percentage of New Yorkers, it's not enough to have surface level theology now. New Yorkers have a high level of educational background. If we want to produce exilic discipleship, people that can engage the world around them, they have to be equipped with a pretty substantial amount of intellectual firepower, because that's the kind of people that they're going to be talking about. These are the people that will ask them hard questions. And so for us to produce exilic discipleship, we can't just take for granted that these people know even the fundamentals of what it means to be a Christian. How was the Bible put together? Why do we have the books in the Bible that we do have? Who determined these books? And all the kind of questions that come, these are the questions that our people often feel ill-equipped. And so our discipleship, exilic discipleship, has to deal with substantive content and intellectual depth. Flexible discipleship to accommodate unpredictable work schedules. When you try to disciple New Yorkers and you have a weekly meeting time, that's just not going to work. And so we have to adapt models to figure out how do we create that flexibility, given the fact that people are always being called into work at odd hours and have to do things in unpredictable ways. And so we have to have the adaptability of a personal trainer, for example. It's the difference between, if you go to a gym, there are set classes that gyms will have, but most New Yorkers will opt for the personal trainer that will fit into their schedule, because it's a priority for them to stay in shape, but they don't have the regularity to go to a consistent class. And so they need that kind of trainer to help them when they have time to grow in these spiritual ways. An integrative approach weaving theology, community, spiritual formation to maximize the likelihood of life integration. Oftentimes, I think as a church, we compartmentalize theological formation, community formation, spiritual formation. Here's a class on the Old Testament. Here's a class on prayer. Here's a class where you can come to know the people in your church. In the city context, again, with little time and resources, all this has to be brought together. People have to see the impact of this together and not in isolation. And what we've seen is that creates a significant impact in the way that people feel equipped and the sense of their own spiritual growth. So those are just 3 examples of how does that exilic discipleship translate for us in New York City. So this is a concept that we don't use this language up front. This is what we would call the back-end language. And if you go to Redeemer and they say, we heard this talk about exilic discipleship, they'll just give you a funny face. We don't talk about it in this context, but I use the word exilic because of the biblical, I'm hoping we have a common biblical background here, and so that provides a bit more context for that term. But that's something that we're really struggling with, because I think we haven't really understood the impact of living in a world that is not a theocracy. We're not in Jerusalem. And what does that mean for the way that we structure our programs? And we're experimenting with in the fall, we started experimenting with 3-month intensive groups. So instead of, for example, meaning the whole year, every week in a small group, what if we had 3-month intensive groups where there was a higher level of commitment and there was a set of very trained lay people leading these groups? What would be the impact of that? Would that actually lead to more significant spiritual growth and discipleship? And the net impact of that initial pilot was that the people going through that 3-month intensive felt better equipped, better connected to their community, and more eager to engage the world. So that's some interesting data for us. Because if you can send people through a 3-month discipleship and give them 9 months to engage the culture, to engage their community, be on the co-op board, get involved on local community boards, that's going to make a bigger difference in the city than having them stay in the church year-round and not have the time to actually get involved in the areas that you want them to. So there's some kind of structural implications for this kind of larger context of either Jerusalem or exile. Let me stop there for a second, and I want to, because this is the dreaded afternoon spot, instead of me going on to this next part, I did want to just camp out here for a little bit, see if there are any questions, just to get a little interaction going. If you hate the idea, if you love the idea, I'd love to hear what some of your thoughts or questions are before I go into the second part of what is this, how are we equipping people in terms of the theology of looking at the world around them?
One of the things that I'm seeing with younger pastors is that they have never worked themselves. So how does somebody that's never worked themselves ever going to feel comfortable talking to anybody other than people that are just like themselves, who are pastors or in the church? They're church people. They have no affinity to what it means to actually work, period. Much less just work outside the church. They've never done it.
Absolutely. Well, the church has been experts of teaching people on subjects that they know very little about. If you think about most of human church history, you had these celibate men teaching about marriage, about raising your kids. So this is not a foreign concept for the church, but the way that we approach it for our fellows program, which I'll talk about later, the pastor is sitting at the same table with all the other people working in the arts industry, the finance industry, the medical industry, the legal industry. And we are one of many professions. We are part of the priesthood of all believers. And so there is no pretext that somehow we understand everything that everyone is doing in the same way that no one else in that table understands what anyone else is doing around the table. So we come as peers in that sense to learn. And I think part of it is the humbling of the pastor to sit not as an elevated teacher, but to learn from the people around them, to understand what's happening in the industries and companies that these people are representing. So in our fellows program, we've had in the last few years very senior level pastors as a fellow. These aren't our entry-level pastors. These are our lead pastors who have gone through these programs. And so for them, they're transformed because we're reading some theological texts, and they've read them in seminary, but they've never discussed it with lay people. And it's amazing to see what lay people will take out of a theological text and the applications that they'll instinctively and intuitively do into their profession. And I'll say the preaching of those pastors, I think it improves significantly because they're able to hear every week, what these people are going through. So the answer is, I don't think you need to go have an extensive background in a lot of industries as long as you're listening to people who are in those industries and growing in the understanding of what their week-to-week challenges are. But you need a context to be able to do that. And typically, most pastors are too busy to develop that kind of regular listening time. And a program like the Gotham Fellows program creates that structure for pastors to do that for 9 months, to listen to a group of 12 to 14 lay people, journey with them for that year, and listen to the ups and downs of the kind of calendar year and the impact that the theology that they're learning is having on their vocational life.
Is it your assumption that the exilic perspective is now and should be normative for the church? And if so, could you develop that a little bit?
Yeah, that's a big question, and I'd say the answer for me is kind of a yes and no. I think the exilic paradigm is a dominant one because in the language of the New Testament, that's the metaphor that is almost exclusively given for the church. In terms of how do we understand the church, the people of God, it's always that context of we are citizens of a different kingdom. Again, aliens and strangers. We're exiles living in a foreign empire. This is not our world. We are, God has taken us out of the kingdom of this world and into the kingdom of his Son, whom he loves. And so when you just do a biblical study in the New Testament of the identity of the people of God, it's quite consistent. But at the same time, those different contexts of Jerusalem, pre-exile, exile, post-exile, I think we need to learn from all of those passages in understanding our context better. I think that gives us kind of a nuanced understanding of where we find ourselves. And when you think about this, and one of the things that really intrigued me is we have 4 gospel books to understand the life of Christ. We have 16 prophetic books. 12 of them minor, 4 of them major, 5 major, 11 minor, I believe. I need to do but it's around there, right? This is a pastor's conference, right? So we can share how ignorant we are of the Bible. But all that to say, there seems to be a lot of writing in this whole exilic, pre-exilic, post-exilic period. It's almost like God wants to tell us, I want you to understand this period really well. Because a lot of us, it's kind of like you read one minor prophet, you've read them all, so why bother to preach through them? But it's almost like God is saying, look, it's kind of like reading Mark and Matthew. There are a lot of similarities, but you still read them both because it's the nuancing and the differences between those 2 gospels that help to give that 3-dimensional character of Christ. And I think that's the same for that exilic period, that all these minor prophets are giving us, in some sense, in digital surround sound, this idea of the exile and how the people of God are to live. And unfortunately, if you were to take a census of all the books that typical pastors will preach through, I'd say the smallest corpus of books that are preached through are precisely those prophetic books, especially the minor prophets. So that's, I think, why our theology is so lacking when it comes to what it means to live as exiles in our world today. Okay, maybe one more question, and I want to move on to...
Could you speak more about that 3-month small group or 3-month long training that you mentioned?
So this was an experiment. So we have a 9-month leaders training program called the Gotham Fellowship. And one of the initiatives of our church is to really empower the lay people of our church. Because with a church that's growing, we can't hire staff at the rate of our church growth. And so we need to have empower our lay people to do more significant ministry. The 9-month program is our kind of highest level training program for lay people. The people that graduate from that program, we did a pilot to say, could they actually lead a 3-month mini version of that 9-month in a way that would be more intensive teaching and spiritual formation and community formation compared to our existing small group structure. Our small group structure takes in a lot of our congregants, but because of the volume, sometimes the quality of the teaching is lower, as well as people are coming in and out week to week, so the community is not necessarily that committed. And so we wanted to experiment what would happen if we had lay leaders who had been trained to lead these small groups with respect to the teaching that the participants experienced, as well as the depth of formation, both spiritually as well as community formation. The answers, and we did 3 of these pilot groups. The answer was overwhelmingly positive, meaning with these leaders, with our typical small group leaders, we give them kind of materials that takes them step by step. So they're essentially just facilitating their group because they're just reading off of a sheet. With these leaders, we just said, here's a framework. Here are 3 books we want you to cover. Now go at it. That's real leadership when you just tell them they need to develop the week-to-week curriculum. But that was part of the experiment. And what we found out at the end of the 3 months is that participants, their feedback was, we never realized we needed this. Because they hadn't experienced community at that level, as well as the teaching at that level. And so from the participant end, they felt a much stronger experience of discipleship. For the lay leaders, it was a lot of work for them, but they loved it. They were giving back to the church what they had received in the training that they had in the 9-month program. And so they all re-upped to do a second time. And now those 3 months, the people that have been through the 3 months, they want to continue, but they want to meet monthly. So they want to be able to encourage each other, but they still want to engage kind of the things that they're involved in. And so this is all very new material for us. We're just kind of trying to process what's the impact of that. But there are some really creative ideas that are kind of percolating in all of our different departments to figure out ways in which we can use that information to make our discipleship more effective across the church. Yeah. Well, let me go now into the second part, because this first part was just trying to create the case for thinking perhaps in this different paradigm of exile versus Jerusalem. And now the second part is, if you buy into this idea that we need this exilic kind of background, what's paramount in an exilic discipleship is an understanding of the world around them. Some people call this public theology. How does God interact with the world outside the church? Why would God be interested in civil society? And the gap here that exists is between the Bible in a time of the New Testament. There isn't this thing called civil society. There are no corporations. It is pluralistic in some sense, but it's far removed from the world that we live in. And so people have a hard time connecting the world of the Bible to our modern day context today. But it's essential for people to see that if God is indeed sovereign and providential, that there is no gap between God's involvement in the time of Scripture and God's involvement in our time today. We say that, but functionally speaking, we do believe that God's not involved in our day-to-day lives. And we have to come clean about that. When we think about the development of all the industries around us in any community, God has everything to do with the development of those things. It doesn't mean that He baptizes them and they're all good, but He's certainly sovereign and providential over all of it. He doesn't allow anything to exist that He doesn't will. And so if we understand God to be this kind of sovereign God, then how do we connect that in the day-to-day understanding of our society? Now, I want to take us all the way back to Genesis 1, and perhaps for many of you it's kind of a refresher of your Old Testament course. But when we think about the structure of Genesis 1, here is God's big debut. He's saying, this is who I am, world. And He starts by this creation narrative. And the creation narrative, if you read commentators, and I'm stealing this from Bruce Waltke's commentary on Genesis, but creation is really a response to the formlessness and the void. The earth was without form and was empty. And then the rest of the 6 days of creation are a response to that. So in days 1 through 3, God creates these realms, or I would call spheres. So you have the realm of light, the realms of sky and sea in day 2, and the realm of dry land in day 3. And then in the second group, days 4 through 6, the second triad, you have the filling and the flourishing of those spheres. So those spheres enable the filling and the flourishing. So for example, if you were to look at the light in day one, the filling are the light bearers, the sun, the moon, the stars, and the flourishing that those luminaries create. Likewise, day two, when God creates the expanse of the sky and the seas, he then fills and flourishes those expanses with birds and fish. And with each passing day, there is this sense of growing kinetic energy. There's this vibrancy, there's life, activity happening with each successive day. And God says to humanity, this is who I am. But God is revealing himself not just so that we know him, he's revealing himself so that we would know ourselves. Because as people created in the image of God, God reveals himself so that we would know ourselves. This is the first chapter of the Institutes in Calvin. We know ourselves by knowing God, and we know God by knowing ourselves. This very basic structure helps us understand how God is involved in the ongoing progress of history. That when you look at human history, that this is what human beings do in a social space. Let me try to explain what I mean by that. When we look at society and the construction of a civil society, every society has to start with this first sphere, family. Now, families, in order to exist and thrive into a community, they need to depend on each other and work together. So if I'm a farmer, but I want to have meat, I have to somehow create an agreement with a hunter family and say, look, if you give me some deer meat, I will give you some wheat. And then you have the basic starting points of an economic structure, a very basic barter exchange. But inevitably, if I can't make good on the promise of my wheat, there's a disagreement. He can either choose to take it out on me by hurting me, maiming me, killing me maybe, or he could take it to some other authority to somehow adjudicate the differences. So then you have the basic form of a government. Let's say a tribal chief says, okay, I'm going to take your prized family possession and hold it until you pay back the wheat that you promised. And then the meat guy says, okay, I'm good with that. And then I'm able to pay him back later. So governments allow for the stability of a society. And inevitably, as you do all these things of life, we just have this instinctive thing that we call the arts. The hunter, as he's waiting for the kill, he's starting to whittle his spear. You know, as the mother's home waiting for her meal to be cooked, she starts to sing. Her children dance. This thing that we just call the arts just kind of naturally comes out of who we are as people created in the image of God. Now, sociologists will tell us every enduring society needs to have those fundamental spheres. No enduring society has existed that hasn't had those fundamental spheres. What shapes the nature and the quality and the character of those spheres is always a religion that brings definition to those spheres. So when you look at the family structure, whether your background is in Confucianism or your background is in Judeo-Christianity, that's going to shape the way that family structure looks. That's going to shape the way the governmental structure looks. It's going to shape the way that the economic structure looks. So for example, today, even though, let's take the test case of South Korea, a lot of the Western concepts have been imported into this very quickly developing country. But in the West, for corporate leadership, it's usually a meritocracy. The person who can do the job the best becomes the leader. Because of the Confucian background in South Korea, even though South Korea has adopted a lot of the Western practices, the people that still run those large conglomerations are still family members. They're still run, it's still kind of this family-run business, you know, these large mega corporations like Samsung and LG. Why is that the case? Because again, that larger Confucian center is what shapes their understanding of the economic sphere. You know, today, people don't really understand the influence of religion in the formation of civil society. And so when people do studies, and usually the academics are the most irreligious people, they don't take into account the impact of religion in the formation of society. Okay, this is all going somewhere. Now, This is so heavy to do in the afternoon. I'm sorry about this, guys. But I hope this will illuminate a little bit of the world outside. Why would God care about the development of these spheres? Because each of these spheres, in some sense, embodies an essence. It's a quality, a characteristic that without this essence, that sphere would no longer exist or cease to exist. So, for example, the family has at its essence this character of nurture. So that if you have a family that doesn't nurture each other, it cannot endure. Unfortunately, we have a lot of examples of that. And that leads to a lot of brokenness in our society. Similarly, when our economy does not provide opportunity, the economic structure begins to collapse. If we look at the former Soviet Union and the way that the socialistic, communistic kind of political structure did not allow for opportunities, that whole economy began to implode. Again, opportunity creation is critical for a healthy, growing economy. In the sphere of government, justice is a critical essence, so that if a government is not just over time, it's just a matter of time until you have revolution and revolt. And same with the arts. Without imagination, you have a lot of countries that just mimic the art forms of other countries, and people can see that's really flat. That's not art. That's just, you're just trying to build some kind of a business. That's not art. Art has to engage the imagination. Now, those essences, I'm not saying that's the end-all, be-all of those categories. I'm giving you an example. But why would God care about society and those particular essences? Well, let me give you the example of a pastoral case that we often get. If you come across a congregant that says, I grew up in a family where my father was abusive. And so when I read in the Bible, I don't like it that God calls himself Father. I would rather God call himself Mother because I can relate to that. And so I'd rather read a different version of Scripture because the idea of God as Father is offensive to me. And you're listening to that and you're sympathetic because you realize that this person never had the privilege of a father figure that was loving, that was caring, that was protective. Now, extrapolate that to the societal level. And the worst part of it is then she can't relate to God as Father because God is ultimately the Father of fathers. Now, if you extrapolate that to societal level, where you have a society that doesn't have a government that is just, that child will grow up not understanding what justice is in a very concrete way. And so when we read in the Scriptures that God is just, someone growing up in Rwanda now may not understand, what does that mean? Does that mean that God can do whatever he wants with his power? Because that's what I see in our world. If you grow up in a society where there's not opportunity, what does that say about the nature and character of God? Did God place Adam and Eve in a garden that was already fully formed? Meaning, Adam and Eve, here's this wonderful paradise, just sit back, relax, and enjoy it. No, he says, no, be fruitful and multiply, subdue it, make it prosper, make it grow. There was this amazing latency in creation, and God was saying there's amazing possibilities here. Opportunities are endless here. And so now you can begin to see why God would care about the growth of a society such that a healthy, growing society would become material expressions of his invisible character. And that's what we read in Genesis 1 as well as in Romans 1. That the invisible qualities of God have been made manifest in the external visible things. And so when a healthy society begins to be formed that demonstrates these essences, there is a concrete display of God's glory. There are manifold expressions of what it means to say that God is a glorious God. That God is a God who cares, who nurtures his people. God is a God who creates opportunities for his people. God is a God who is just and who's imaginative. And so the glory of God, going back to, at least in my tradition, the Westminster Catechism, the question 1, chief end of man, to glorify God and to enjoy him. That has everything to do with faith and work. What you do in your business, what you do Monday through Friday, those are tangible expressions of the glory of God that you're making manifest in this world. So that when people come to your business, that you run well, that you treat your employees equitably, that things run efficiently, that people that work in your company, there is a sense that they can employ their creativity. They're not just kind of drones or cogs on a wheel. There is an expression of the glory of God such that when you begin to share the gospel with them, Again, there's a plausibility structure. They believe you because they see what you do with your hands. And that's what we need today. We don't need these 6-step ways of evangelizing because people are done with that. You know, the 4 spiritual laws, that may work in other contexts, but at least in America where we've been jaded by all of that, and there's so many movies that kind of mock that whole approach to evangelism, and especially in city context, people are so allergic to this idea of evangelism because of all of the stereotyping. We need to understand what this whole idea of the credibility or plausibility structure creates in the excitement and the incentive to evangelize. And so each societal sphere being renewed becomes a distinct articulation of the glory and love of Christ. And all types of work have meaning as manifold expressions of love and worship. And obviously, this is a very primitive, those 5 spheres there, that represents a very fundamental kind of societal structure. But as societies begin to grow and develop, those primary spheres spawn off secondary spheres and tertiary spheres and so forth and so on, where an advanced society like the ones in the Western world have a proliferation of these spheres. And those spheres are birthed from the existing spheres. And so the more, in a sense, advanced the society becomes, the more tangible and manifold are the expressions of God's character and glory. All right, let me stop there. So we try to equip our people. I didn't give you details. I wanted to start with this session just with the big picture because I think that's what's lacking in our people. There's no sense. We can tell them this is what it looks like day to day to live out your faith in your work, but there's a hunger to connect that to the larger picture, a larger framework of why does my work matter? If I'm working in the finance industry, why should the artist care about what I do? If I'm an artist, why should I care about the finance industry? And what this helps people understand is the interconnectedness and the interdependence of all these spheres, and that our society has a coherence because we believe in a sovereign God. Such that when the financial structures begin to crumble, that affects all the other structures like education, commerce. And we saw that we're living the effects of that in the last 5 years now. And Christians, we have a theology, we have a reason to say we need to care about the whole of society, not just what I do on a day-to-day level, but how my work is part of a larger industry which is connected to different spheres. And once we start to have a larger conception of society, there is a larger kind of renewal that we can bring into our cities and into our states, into our nation. And I think Christians need to have that kind of vision, not just how can I impact the people that I work day to day with, which is critical. But if we don't see how this fits into the larger picture and what is ultimately in view here being the glory of God, I think we're not properly equipping our people with the kind of theology and vision for their lives. So any questions on that second part, if we have time for questions? It just went, you.
So what are you doing at Redeemer to disciple that framework into the lives of your people?
That's part of our Gotham program, the 9 months.
That's the 9-month program.
That is 2 months of the 9 months, because we have to spend a lot of time on people's hearts. Because it's no good if you understand this, but if you're still not convinced you're a sinner. So we'll spend 4 months convincing you you're a sinner. And then we'll spend another 2 months saying how much God loves you. And then we'll go to this stuff.
And then they're taking what they're getting in 9 months, and in 3 months, they're teaching and training others.
That's right. But it won't have this level of specificity. This is kind of the leading edge, I'd say the frontier of our faith and work ministry, because it's the newest for people, and it's going to take time for this to sink in. But what we're saying, I think this model of cultural renewal, it's a different paradigm, because when you look at the history of cultural engagement from the Christian world, those people that chose to engage culture, unfortunately, a lot of the modern paradigm was, yes, engage all these spheres, but get Christians into positions of power. Get them into being CEOs, get them into being presidents. But I'm hoping what you're seeing with this model is different, because it's not about getting Christians into positions of leadership as much as it's about getting people into leadership that understand the nature and the purpose of these spheres. And so here's a controversial question. Is it better to have a non-Christian leading a company who understands what good management is, what it means to responsibly do the books? Or is it better to have a Christian that does it so-so because he spends more time in the church? For the building and flourishing of society, someone who understands how a business ought to run in some ways creates much more flourishing than a Christian that in some ways is not as equipped or as gifted. And unfortunately, I think we don't really get that because we don't understand the value of the work itself. We think as long as the person has a good heart, God can use them. But there's a value to the work itself that creates the kind of flourishing and the prosperity in a city or a community that I think that as Christians we have to kind of develop and understand better. That takes time to understand, to say, when you want to do your job, when I'm working with our professionals, if it's about you, no one's going to come around you to support what you're doing. But if there's a sense that you're committed to your profession, you're committed to your work, I am passionate about my work because there's something important that we're doing here. Other people, when they see that, and I would say that is a spirit-led perspective because it's one that you've died to self and you're starting to see the value of what's at stake here. Other people will come around you to try to promote and support the work that you're doing. And I think we don't see, again, goes back to the Dorothy Sayers quote, the importance of the work itself. That Sayers will argue, if you want to serve the community, focus on the work. Don't focus on the community and have the work to be a byproduct of it.
You mentioned 4 months on sin, 2 months on the love of God, 2 months on this. What's the last 2 months on?
No, that was kind of a caricature. So the real program is we'll spend 1 month in just introduction stuff like Bible, worldview. We'll spend 3 months in how the gospel changes your heart. That's 4 months. We'll have a month off for winter break. 1 month on how the gospel renews relationships and community. And then last, 4 or 5. And then 3 months on the world stuff.
How do we multiply these kind of things in our churches? You were talking about it, but is there going to be an opportunity to hear more detail and practical how we...
Well, I'll do that in the seminar portion. I was told that my practical stuff should be saved. This is more high-level concept. So any high-level concept question? And for me, it's always interesting to talk to new audiences about this to see, is this helpful? Is this something that just seems absurd? Are we off base?
Where does education fit into this?
That is a different sphere. That's a secondary sphere, and it depends on which culture you're talking about. So a lot of this is also history. In the Western world, education kind of came out of the organized religion sphere, to the church. So it's a church and family that kind of became the locus of what we have as our robust education sphere. Medicine, I think, again, it was probably for most of Western history, it was the family and the church that spawned off all of the things, all of the major industries that we have today. Even
cultures, it might be out of government, but the education...
That's right. So modern-day China is a great kind of case study between what happens when you put at the center. I mean, with the Cultural Revolution, I don't know how much of the history of China you know, but when the government really tried to take out religion of their history, including the Confucian past, they wanted to create a modern secularist state that was completely run by the government. They now realize they cannot do that. And so they're importing seminary professors and seminary instructors, by the hundreds to help them understand, because they realize now that Christianity is what created the moral and social infrastructure to allow all the spheres to work. That if you don't have a high degree of trust in a society, you can't have things like business, because the only people you'll trust is your brother, your sister, your uncle, your nephew. But if you have a society like ours where there's trust and then there are laws to support that trust, you can actually now create all these different corporations and businesses that allow for the flourishing of a society. But you can't take that stuff for granted as we're learning.
Does it make any difference, you're making this comparison between the U.S. and China, for instance, that the U.S. historically was so influenced by Christianity that it more feels sometimes like a half exile rather than a full exile. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
How should that interpret how we do our discipleship?
Yeah, I think there's a danger in saying here that this is a baptizing of the West, that somehow the West are, the modern day Israelites, the chosen people. I think that narrative has been intertwined into American history. But there is something to be said that these spheres, there is a design to these spheres because we believe that these are aspects of a God whose character does not change. So that when you have a sphere like the governmental sphere. So, for example, Abraham Kuyper in the early 1900s, he was the Dutch Prime Minister, visited America, very much like Alex de Tocqueville, said, this is again, early 1900s, he said, America would become the most powerful nation in the world. And he was saying that because of the governmental structure he saw and the way that the governmental structure conformed to these ideas of total depravity, meaning the tripartite form of government. Kind of embedded in our governmental structure was this idea that people are in Christian language, sinful. And so by creating this system of checks and balances, there was this acknowledgement of the design order, the truth and reality of our society. And he was looking at different parts of our society, and he made the statement that our society was very much shaped by biblical values and principles. And for those reasons, he was fully confident that this society would actually prosper significantly. So all that to say, it's not a baptizing of this, as to say this is the only way societies can develop. But I also want to say certain structures will thrive with certain values that really drive it. Unfortunately, today, what's being forgotten are the concept of the essences. We don't know what should be the defining essence of a family, for example. That's really, up for grabs today. Christians, in some sense, we're fighting for sometimes the superficial aspects of these spheres, but without really understanding what's at the heart of what these spheres are supposed to do and supposed to be. For example, technology. I mean, when you look at church history, the church has always advocated or used technology to promote human relationships. So, for example, one of the early examples is the chiming of the bell, the monk that would chime the bell for prayer and meal times. That technology of the bell allowed for people who were working in different distant parts of an area, farming, doing random things, to know this was the time to eat together. This was the time to pray together before we all had wristwatches. That allowed and supported human relationships. But today, when you read books like Sherry Turkle's Alone Together, technology is actually dehumanizing us. Instead of enhancing human relationships, it's actually replacing them. And she notes that robots are becoming more human and humans are becoming more robotic. That's the way the technology space is moving. But where is a church that says, no, simply stated, technology should enhance human relationships and not replace them? Because we're not thinking about work for its own sake and how that fits into the larger quality and character of God and the flourishing of society. Again, we don't have a theology of the public square, so we're not even asking these questions. Where's the mic? I'm looking.
Just a reminder that you have 10 minutes for this session. So
Okay, 10 minutes left?
10 minutes left.
Oh, great, wow. Any other thoughts? I mean, there's other material I can go into, but I would love to hear your thoughts.
Just have a question about the big picture idea of this. As you guys, you mentioned that obviously there's a difference in plausibility structure in a center like New York City, and there's obviously a diverse level of biblical worldview, understanding, or introduction to the Bible at all. So I'm assuming that a lot of the people who are in this program being introduced to these ideas don't have a lot of intense Bible knowledge or training coming in. And so my curiosity, I'm thinking, how do you find them interacting with these ideas that you're presenting, coming in without, with that framework, those lenses? Are they positive? Do they resonate? Or
Yeah.
does it take a long time for them to be connected?
No, it actually, what we're surprised is that what we always hear every year is, how come I never heard this growing up in the church? For them, it's a no-brainer. Like, this stuff just, why didn't anyone tell me this? So no one ever pushes back in the sense that, like, this doesn't make sense to me, David, I don't like this. It's, why didn't I grow up hearing this stuff? That God cares about all these other things out there. And so the concept and the ideas, they're not that complicated, but it does, for a lot of people, they get angry. they get upset at in a sense, you know, the way that they were brought up, focusing on evangelism as the primary kind of duty of the Christian, and not understanding the way that our work is very much related to our evangelism. And same with me. When I remember in my after I graduated college, I worked in a hospital, and I had that same mentality. I was just looking for those moments where I could just share the gospel. I was trying to be a faithful Christian, and I started a Bible study with my coworkers. But I could say, you know, my work as a lab technician, it was okay. I wasn't like messing things up and getting diagnoses wrong, but I wasn't thinking about my work as my primary, as an important part of my Christian witness. And I look back, and I'm almost embarrassed by some of the things I said, you know, because they would have no reason to believe me. I just seemed like one of those crazy evangelical Christians. There they go talking about Jesus again, when my work is it's just kind of mediocre. And so I wish I had learned this. I learned a lot of this stuff after seminary, actually. So, you know, for me, being in ministry and going to seminary, I learned all the kind of traditional theological frameworks. But then, you know, when I'm trying to I worked in campus ministry after I graduated seminary for 12 years, and I started to see what we were discipling them as undergraduates, and then seeing what was happening when they graduated. And you guys all know that statistic. You know, there's this huge disconnect when people get into the real world. All of a sudden, all the stuff that you've taught them, they don't know how to access that anymore. And so I began to really ask questions of how does this stuff, this amazing, coming from a Reformed theological perspective, how does the riches and the depth of Reformed theology actually help people on the ground? And that's what really led me to a lot of these questions, to look for the theology out there that would help me understand and piece together this kind of complex we live in.
Thank you, David.
Thank you.
And, we do have a breakout, so I want you to stay here for just a second. I want to give some directions. First, thank each of you for coming. We're not going to have another assembly coming back together at the end, but I'll let you know that we have everyone's emails. That was part of the registration, and these presentations and PowerPoints we're going to make available to you. We'll send out an email that'll just give you a link if you want to go and get that. And we videoed the main lectures and video of this as well. That will be available to you also. And then I wanted to say to you, thank you for allowing us to learn together. As I was been challenged all day, just realizing that we have the responsibility to keep on learning so that we can keep on